Welcome, everyone. We'll just give people a minute or two to settle in. All right. I like your background, Noam.
Well, hopefully you can see this view in person. It's the Hebrew University.
Beautiful. All right, so as people are settling in, I want to go ahead and welcome you to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. I'm the Associate Director for Research, Didi Kuo, and I thank you for joining us. It's crazy to me that this is our next to last seminar, and we're very delighted to be continuing our discussion. If you were here a few weeks ago, a discussion about radical American partisanship. Today, we're going to talk about affective polarization and comparative perspective. And Noam is going to conclude by offering some insights into politics where he is in Israel, which have been in the news recently. So today, let me go ahead and introduce Noam Gidron, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and the Joint Program in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research interests lie at the intersection of political behavior and political economy. And today he'll be discussing a new book that he's just written on the topic of affective polarization. Next week will be our final seminar of the year before we stop for the summer. And next week is going to be a presentation by the award winners of our CDDRL Fisher Family Honors Program. And these are seniors who are writing theses on topics related to democracy and rule of law. So we hope that you can join us for that. Today, if you have any questions during Noam's talk, please use the Q&A box. If you're a member of the CDDRL community and you'd wish to unmute to ask your question, please indicate that when you're typing in your question, and we'll be sure to leave plenty of time for discussion. So Noam, please go ahead.
Thank you, Didi, and thanks everyone for showing up. I'm so honored to present here in this seminar, and I want to thank Didi and Audrey for helping organizing everything and the kind invitation to present my work here. And first, also let me know that everything that I'll be presenting today is based on shared work with two friends and colleagues, Jim Adams from UC Davis and Will Horn from Princeton University. I'll also note that Will Horn will soon be on the job market, the political science job market, and you should definitely keep an open eye for him. He's great. Okay, as we all know, and I'm sure that people in the audience here are familiar with debates about contemporary developments in political science and American politics, but still, as we all know, polarization is one of the defining features of contemporary American politics. And we have in political science multiple studies that examine different aspects, different dimensions of polarization, its historical roots, its psychological underpinnings, and its implications for the quality of democracy. And sounds like you've already discussed some of these issues in your seminar. Now, like most interesting concepts in the social sciences, polarization is a multidimensional concept. Until not long ago, most of the discussion about polarization revolved around ideological polarization, disagreements on key policy positions. More recently, scholars have shifted their attention from ideological dimensions of polarization to its emotional aspects. This is what we call affective polarization, dislike, resentment, and hostility across party lines. And this type of polarization, this deep resentment across party lines, may be especially pernicious. This is because affective polarization or partisan resentment is associated with a bunch of negative outcomes, such as unwillingness to interact with supporters of opposing parties, lower trust in government, and perception that politics is highly polarized ideologically. And in their best-selling and very important book, How Democracies Die, Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt identified this partisan resentment as a fundamental, in fact, the fundamental problem facing American democracy today. So we know that affective polarization, this resentment and hostility across party lines, is high in the US. And just to give an example, we have evidence that in the 60s, about 5% of Americans were upset with their child marrying someone from the other party, but that figure jumped to 1/3 of Democrats and 1/2 of Republicans by 2010. And there is a lot we can learn, indeed already a lot that we have learned, from studying the US as a case of intense polarization. But as a comparativist, and my co-authors here are also comparativists, we couldn't but wonder, the US is polarized, but compared to which countries? And more broadly, when and where should we expect affective polarization to be more or less intense? How does it vary across different parties and within different parties over time? And what can we learn about these cross-national differences about polarization in the US? Is the US an extremely effectively polarized society compared to other countries? Or do we think that it's highly polarized simply because this is the one country in which we actually examined and measured how people feel toward partisan opponents? So these are the questions motivating a short book that I recently published with Cambridge University Press in the Cambridge Elements series in American politics. And in this book, we analyze comparative data from 20 democracies in order to situate American affective polarization within a broader perspective. And as I'll say more about in a second, also consider structural factors that may help explain where and when we can expect affective polarization to intensify or diffuse. So in the rest of our conversation today, I want to first provide some data that will help situate American affective polarization in broad comparative perspective. And as I discussed with Didi before, I'm going to focus on the big picture and the key findings, and I will not dwell too much on issues of measurement and variable operationalization, but I'm very happy to talk about these issues later on in the Q&A. Okay, after providing some descriptive statistics about how the US compares to other countries in terms of affective polarization, I will discuss 3 structural factors that help explain cross-national differences in how people feel toward political opponents. I will just say a few words about the economic factors, then a little bit more about different types of ideological disagreements, which types are more closely associated with partisan resentment. And then I'll elaborate a bit more on the issue of electoral rules, electoral systems, and how they relate to affective polarization. And lastly, Didi suggested that I also connect our work, the work I'm presenting here today, to recent developments in Israel. We've been through a very tumultuous political time here in the last 2 years. So in the last part of my talk, I'll say a little bit about how differences between the US majoritarian electoral system and the Israeli highly proportional electoral system, how these differences help explain recent political developments in Israel. Okay, so let's begin with situating American affective polarization in comparative perspective. Is the US an extreme case of affective polarization? Is it an extreme case of partisan resentment, of negative emotions between supporters of different parties? I think that to a large degree, this is the impression that one may get from reading either the news in the US or the academic literature that has focused so much on polarization specifically in the US. So in order to answer this question, together with my colleagues, we analyzed data from the comparative study of electoral systems, which provided us with information about 20 Western democracies with data that has been collected since the mid-90s. To measure affective polarization, we are using a survey question that is called the feeling thermometer. It's a survey question that asks people, survey respondents, how they feel toward different parties in their country on a scale that ranges from 0 to 10. And this is the most common survey question used to measure affective polarization in both the US and abroad. I should note that there are other important and useful measures of partisan resentment. For instance, the question I mentioned before that asks people how they would feel if someone from their family would marry someone from the opposing party. Unfortunately, we simply don't have comparable data about these types of social distance preferences across different countries. So all of the analysis that I'll be showing today are based on these feeling thermometer survey questions. And we are following the standard in the literature and measure affective polarization as the difference between in-party thermometer scores and out-party thermometer scores. Put differently, we measure affective polarization as the difference between how much people like their own party and how much they dislike other parties in their country. So just to put a number on these very broad terms, in the United States, the average difference between how much Americans like their own party and how much they dislike the other party is a bit more than 4 points on the 0 to 10 scale in the comparative study of electoral systems data. In countries with higher scores, higher than 4 points, affective polarization is more intense. In countries with lower scores, affective polarization is less intense. And here I should say, okay, I won't say much more about measurement, I promise. Okay, let's see how the cross-national trends look. When we simply plot averages of affective polarization in the 20 democracies, Western democracies that we are analyzing, we are looking here at averages over a time period of 25 years. We actually see that the United States does not in any way stand out as an outlier in its levels of affective polarization. It's actually situated not so far from the middle of our list of 20 countries. So yes, in some countries, partisan resentment, affective polarization is on average much lower than in the US. For instance, that would be the case in the Netherlands, where on average, the difference between how much people like their own party and how much they dislike the other party is just about 3 points on the scale from 0 to 10. And in other countries, such as Finland and Norway, again, we find lower levels of affective polarization compared to the US. That being said, in other countries, for instance, in those countries in Southern Europe, Spain, Greece, Portugal, affective polarization is actually significantly higher than what we find in the US. And in a bunch of other countries, it's just very similar to what we find in the US. Now, it's important to know that not all is well with the US in terms of affective polarization. Here I'm showing you averages over 25 years. If we shift to changes over time, remember that our time series begins in the mid-90s, we do find that affective polarization intensified more strongly in the US compared to most other Western democracies. Now, it's important to know that there isn't an overwhelming trend across all countries toward more partisan resentment. In some countries, affective polarization increased, like in the US. In other, it subsided. And in many other cases, it simply fluctuates. So the trend over time in the US of growing affective polarization is indeed growing compared to what we see in other countries. But still, the US is not an outlier in how negatively people feel toward political opponents, partisan opponents. And I think it's important to also know that we are not saying we shouldn't be worried about what's going on in the US. I think it's important to contextualize the American case. And if we are worried about affective polarization in the US, we have plenty of reasons to worry about affective polarization also in other Western democracies, for instance, specifically in Southern Europe. Okay. So we situated American affective polarization in comparative perspective, and we've seen that the US is not an outlier when it comes to levels of affective polarization. Now let's take a look at structural factors that may help us explain why affective polarization may be more intense in some countries than in others. What can help us explain these cross-national variations that we've seen before. And before I present more empirical findings, I want to situate where our work fits with the literature. I also understand that you had previous talks about this topic, so maybe it will help bring together debates about this issue. A lot of the work about polarization in the US is inspired by theories in political psychology. And this perspective builds on certain human qualities. It talks about how people are wired to think in terms of groups, in terms of us versus them, in order to explain partisan resentment. Our goal here is to complement this emphasis on individual level psychological drivers of partisan resentment with an analysis of structural factors. The psychological perspective, with its very universal assumptions about human nature and how people are wired, provide us with rich insights about how people behave, but we think that an emphasis on structural factors can help explain why people are more polarized in certain contexts than in others. Okay, so let's begin with a discussion of the economic underpinnings of affective polarization. We focus on two main variables, economic inequality and unemployment. And here in both figures on the y-axis, you can see our measure of affective polarization, where higher values denote more intense affective polarization. And as expected, more adverse economic conditions predict more intense affective polarization, greater partisan resentment. Relevant to note, when thinking about inequality, we are mostly just comparing countries because there's not so much difference in inequality within the relatively short time span that we are looking at. Inequality is a slow-moving variable, but unemployment fluctuates more quickly also within countries over time. And our finding that unemployment is predictive of greater affective polarization also holds within countries, not just between countries. Now, it's interesting to think about the implications of these findings specifically for the US. The high levels of economic inequality in the US, you can see that it's the most unequal country in our sample. These high levels of inequality are fertile ground for intense affective polarization. But the relatively low levels of unemployment in the US actually push affective polarization in the opposite direction toward lower levels of partisan resentment. So it's concerning that affective polarization in the US has increased even at a time when unemployment was relatively low. And if unemployment increases again and remains high, this would not bode well for the trajectory of American affective polarization. So next to economic underpinnings of affective polarization, we also examined the role of ideological disagreements between different parties. And here there is a debate still going on among scholars of American politics. Some scholars argue that affective polarization is rooted in ideological disagreements between parties. We dislike partisan opponents because we disagree with them. And from this perspective, it makes sense that affective polarization in the US intensified at the same time in which ideological polarization between the Democrats and Republicans also increased. But other scholars in the US argue that affective polarization is rooted not so much in ideological worldviews. Perhaps most people don't really have well-structured ideological worldviews, but instead in group identities. And Liliana Mason, which you've heard before, very nicely puts it when she said that people can disrespectfully agree. That is, they may hate and dislike partisan opponents, even in the absence of strong ideological disputes. So this debate is still ongoing among scholars of American politics. Our intuition, based on literature in comparative politics, was that it's not enough to just look at ideological disagreements on the overall conservative or liberal dimension, or as we would say in most other Western democracies, ideological disagreements on the overall left-right dimension. And this is because some specific issues more easily lend themselves to negative emotions toward political opponents, or put differently, some issues more easily lend themselves to affective polarization. And specifically, issues that relate to national identity, to core cultural values. Those are the issues that tend to feel angrier to people. They generate more intense emotional reactions than the more traditional issues of economic redistribution and state intervention in the economy. So in our analysis, we distinguish between two dimensions of ideological disputes. The more traditional economic dimension of state intervention in the economy, who gets what, and the more cultural dimension of national identity and multiculturalism, who we are. We developed cross-national comparative measures of elite ideological disagreements on both the economic and cultural dimensions based on data on party platforms or manifesto. We use here data from the Comparative Manifesto project. And here what we find is that when elite cultural polarization increases, affective polarization also increases. But we do not find a similar relationship for economic disagreements. So not all ideological disputes matter to the same degree when we think about affective polarization. Now, again, let's focus specifically on the US. According to our measures of ideological positions, cultural polarization in the US intensified more strongly in the US than in most other countries. In 1996, the first data point we have, the US was especially low on cultural polarization, while in 2016, it was especially high compared to other Western democracies. Personally, I didn't expect this, but I think it speaks very nicely to the fact that we see a sharper increase in affective polarization in the US than in most other countries. Now, I'll also note that we can debate whether it's good or bad normatively that disagreements on cultural issues generate this type of affective response, affective polarization. Fighting politically for greater inclusion and equality of marginalized groups in terms of sexual identity, ethnicity, or racial identity is something that most people would consider good and beneficial, even if it's reflected in greater elite cultural polarization and then also leads to more affective polarization. So we are not making here a strong normative statement, but instead we want to show that affective polarization is related with these cultural disagreements, but not so much with economic disagreements. Okay, lastly, the last factor that I will be discussing is that of electoral systems, electoral rules. And here some of the foundational work in comparative institutionalism suggests that proportional systems give rise to kinder, gentler politics. This is what we learned from Leipart in one of the most important work on electoral systems. Now, the other side of the coin is that research on the United States suggests that the two-party system generates a doom loop of polarization, inability to work together, no incentive to compromise, and it follows also partisan resentment and affective polarization. And again, we want to examine this issue from a broad comparative perspective. We think that you have to examine this issue from a comparative perspective because electoral rules very rarely change within countries. So you need to adopt this cross-national perspective. And for those who are interested in measurement, we measure proportionality by the log of the district magnitude. I'll just give the intuition. Lower values on this scale mean more majoritarian systems, and that's why we'll see low values for countries like the US and the UK with a majoritarian system. Higher values on the scale of proportionality denote more proportional systems, and that's why we will see the Israel and the Netherlands and other Western European countries with higher values on the scale of proportionality. And here we have, I think, interesting findings showing that greater proportionality is associated both with warmer feelings toward one's own parties, but also with warmer feelings or less negative feelings toward opposing parties. So in a way, it suggests that proportional representation provides you goods from two different directions. First, people who live in political systems or political contexts with more proportional systems feel better about their own party, and at the same time, they also feel better about the opposing parties. So it also suggests that affective polarization is not a zero-sum game. Actually, in those political contexts, which are more proportional, where one has positive feelings toward one's own party, one also has more positive feelings toward the other parties. So let me just summarize the main points from the empirical analysis I presented here. First, affective polarization varies across and within countries. And perhaps surprisingly, the US is not an outlier when we look at levels averaged over 25 years of partisan resentment and dislike. That being said, as I mentioned before, if we look at change over time, affective polarization intensified more strongly in the US compared to most Western democracies. And what I've also shown is that affective polarization is associated not only with these psychological mechanisms that people have already discussed in research on this topic, but also with structural factors. It's higher where inequality and unemployment are high. It's higher where cultural elites disagreements run deeper. And it's higher in more majoritarian electoral systems. Now, of course, for those who are interested in research designs, I know that everything I presented is correlations, not causal evidence, because we simply do not know much about this topic. We believe that the first step in advancing this emerging research agenda of comparative polarization is to simply understand what's going on, when and where affective polarization is more intense, and then we can think more about the causal mechanisms. Okay, so in the last few minutes that I still have, I'll just reflect maybe very broadly about differences in the electoral systems in US and Israel. And I think that now we are in a really interesting point thinking about these two countries compared to one another. In the US, we see growing concerns about the consequences of the two-party system, right? How to fix democracy, how we can introduce some proportional measures into the American majoritarian system. And this debate is taking place at the exact same time when people in Israel are increasingly concerned about the consequences of our multi-party system. So we had 4 elections in 2 years, and it's very likely that we will be heading to a 5th election in just a few weeks. And people believe that this is because the system is so proportional that it has become impossible to form a government. So what can we learn from this about proportional representation? I presented before the beneficial aspect of proportional representation for this issue of affective polarization, and we've seen that affective polarization tends to be lower in more proportional systems. It's important to note that proportional representation is far from a magic solution to affective polarization. For instance, let's compare the affective distance, the difference between how much people like their own party and how much they dislike other parties. We can compare this distance between the 2 largest parties in the US and in Israel. In the US, of course, we are looking at the Democrats and Republicans, and the difference between how much partisans in the US like their own parties and how much they dislike the other party is about 4.7 points on a scale from 0 to 10. Let's now shift to the Israeli context and look at the 2 largest parties in Israel using data I collected with Dr. Lior Shefer from Tel Aviv University just a few weeks ago. And in Israel, the 2 largest parties are the right-wing Likud, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the centrist, or maybe center-left, Yesh Atid, There's a Future, led by Yair Lapid. You can see these 2 gentlemen here. And the affective distance between supporters of these 2 parties in Israel is about 7 points on the same scale. So 50% higher, actually, than what we see in the US between the Democrats and Republicans. So proportional representation is not a magic solution to affective polarization. That being said, I do think that proportional representation also proposes mechanism to diffuse polarization. So we do have affective polarization in proportional system, but there are also mechanisms to address it. And coalition governments are one such key mechanism. And we've seen this very recently when it comes to feelings or affective evaluations of those parties that are associated with the Arab or Palestinian minority, Palestinian citizens of Israel. These Arab parties, as they are commonly called in Israel, have never been in government. They've always been excluded for government. And most Israeli survey respondents, Jewish respondents, express very negative feelings toward these Arab parties. But in the last few weeks, because of the stalemate in Israeli politics, we've seen some signals from Jewish political leaders about potential coalition with these Arab parties. And just these signals of potential coalitions have already led to warmer feelings toward these parties. So this suggests a more general mechanism that coalition governments lead to warmer feelings between governing parties. In proportional systems, yes, of course, people dislike some parties and opponents, but after election, there's a need to come together and form a government. And once the government is formed, the people tend to express much more positive feelings toward other parties that govern with their preferred party. So PR, of course, we also find affective polarization in proportional systems, but we also have this mechanism to diffuse it. Okay, so let me bring it all together and I'll finish with that. First, just based on the presentation, I hope that I convinced you in the case of thinking about studying American politics in general and studying American polarization from a comparative perspective. And Didi, of course, has also contributed to this comparative shift in the study of American politics. And we think that it's really important to situate what we find in the US compared to other countries, because that provides some context and perspective to thinking about local developments. In terms of specific findings, we've shown that the US is not an exception in terms of partisan resentment, and that affective polarization is rooted in these structural factors of economic development, the type of ideological disagreements, and electoral rules. And thinking about the difference between majoritarian and proportional systems, I pointed at one potential mechanism that has been especially dominant or prominent here in Israel in the last few weeks, and that's the mechanism of coalition government as one way to diffuse partisan tension after elections. So I'll finish with that, and I look forward to our conversation. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Noam, for that fascinating talk. So to the members of our audience, I see a hand raised. If you could just type in a question to the Q&A, that would be helpful. And we will get to as many questions as we can. So anyone who does have a question, feel free to go ahead and ask it now, and we'll be able to hopefully get to you. So Noam, I wanted to start by asking about some of the Southern European countries that are more affectively polarized. In a recent book by Jonathan Hopkin called Anti-System Parties, he notes that after the financial crisis, there's a real division in Europe between creditor countries and debtor countries. And Southern Europe, Greece, Italy, and Spain are really the debtor countries, and they have produced more anti-system politics, extremist parties on the far right, and in the case of Podemos on the left. So I'm wondering if the affective polarization measure is a product of the fact that you have more extremism in the party system that you don't necessarily find in majoritarian systems like Golden Dawn or the Lega in those other countries.
Okay, perfect. So that's a really important question. So first of all, I'm a big fan of this book by Hopkins, so everyone should definitely read it. But thinking about the issue you raised, so the question is whether we are finding more intense affective polarization in these Southern European countries because we have very extreme parties. Now, but I think here we should keep in mind, and I think that one of the benefits of the comparative perspective, we also have very extreme parties in some of the Northern European countries. In fact, some of the largest radical right parties are located in the Nordic countries, including Denmark, Norway. We also have dominant radical right parties in the Netherlands and in Austria. So the rise of far parties, radical right parties, may not be the single factor that is driving this increased affective polarization in the Southern European countries. I do think that the financial crisis plays a role. We do see that affective polarization increased in these countries following the massive rise in unemployment after the economic crisis. So I think maybe that has more to do with what's unique about these countries. We can say some more about radical right parties and affective polarization if that comes up later on, because that's also an interesting topic.
Okay, so on this question of unemployment and inequality after the financial crisis, as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, there already has been extreme unemployment, higher levels of unemployment every week in the United States since March 2020 than any week following the financial crisis in 2008 or 9. So that only changed about a whole calendar year later. So there are two arguments about what a crisis can do in a political system.
Yeah.
One is that it can create unity, and the other is that it can drive dynamics that you've discussed here, affective polarization. So
Yeah.
what do you think the likely economic effects of COVID-19 will be on unemployment and on inequality, and how will that affect outcomes like polarization?
Yeah, so we were finishing writing this book just as the corona pandemic started, and we thought, okay, we're not going to get any data that directly speak to these developments, unfortunately. I think that exactly as you mentioned, it to some degree depends on the frameworks that people use to make sense of what's going on, whether that's something that brings us all together, or we should actually blame the other side for how they have handled these all the negative consequences of the pandemic. And unfortunately, our data stopped just a little bit before the pandemic erupted, so we can't speak directly to that. That being said, if the changes in levels of unemployment are not going to be long-term, and it's just like a moment in time, it's hard to know whether they would actually affect this type of affective polarization measures. I think here in Israel, the situation is already getting much better in terms of the economic consequences of the pandemic. So it also depends on the time horizon, and who knows.
Okay. So there's a question from the audience of, do you have anything to say about whether or not affective polarization domestically affects international or geopolitical relationships? And if so, what is the effect?
Yeah, so honestly, I don't know. I think maybe some of you in the audience are the experts, considering I'm here at CDDRL, but I should just be open and say that we haven't looked at the implications for foreign policy decision-making or foreign policy attitudes. So I cannot speak to this issue.
Do you want to venture a guess about whether the erosion of democratic norms, the fact that Freedom House and international, like the World Bank, and have noted not the World Bank, but sort of development indicators, that there's been a decline in democratic indicators or the quality of democracy in a bunch of different countries, and therefore maybe less support for the liberal international order. Do you think that that has the effect of at least allowing further polarization domestically?
So perhaps, but just to play the devil's advocate, we may actually argue, and I was trying to suggest something in this direction earlier, that to some degree, this rise in affective polarization in some cases reflects the case that we have growing ideological polarization on cultural issues, because there's this efforts for equal rights for minority groups, for disadvantaged groups, and this is pushing forward cultural disagreements, which may also be reflected in higher levels, of affective polarization, but may actually bolster participation, equality, inclusion. So I think that the normative implications here are not straightforward, and it's not obviously the case that all sources of affective polarization are negative.
Right. Okay, so there's a question about that from the audience. Do you find that baseline levels of diversity or homogeneity in countries, I'm guessing on an ethnic or racial dimension, have any kind of relationship to polarization? And alternatively, did you measure levels of immigration as well?
Yes, we have, and we didn't find a relationship. Now, granted, I should say that we don't work with a huge sample. We have 20 Western democracies, and we are not looking at a very long time period. Our data go back only to the mid-90s, but we did look at demographic changes and changes in base levels of heterogeneity on all sorts of indicators, and we couldn't find a direct relationship.
Okay, that's interesting. So there's a question here about whether or not the literature on affective polarization drawn from social psychology about how we're group oriented and hardwired, in the psychology literature, there's counter evidence indicating that people are socialized, they are nurtured, they have familial and community environments that also affect how they think. Is there something equivalent in the study of affective polarization in politics, that there are different ways of countering polarization through a process of political socialization?
Yeah, so I think that now we see more and more, well, maybe until a few years ago, we've seen a lot of work about the drivers of affective polarization in the US, like what I've shown today from a comparative perspective. And now I think we have more and more work about how we can try and address it in all sorts of ways. And some people suggest that maybe one way of doing that is by bringing together supporters of different parties and letting them socialize and getting to know one another. And this type of contact hypothesis, that contact can actually improve our impressions or our feelings, empathy toward the other side. And some argue that it can work under certain conditions when it comes to ethnic or racial relations, and now there's work examining this hypothesis also when it comes to intergroup relations, into partisan relations. What we are trying to think about are the structural or institutional factor that may actually incentivize elites to work together in a way that would later trickle down to more positive feelings toward partisan opponents, also at the mass level. I think that's the mechanism behind the proportional systems and lower levels of affective polarization, the fact that people have to work together across party lines when forming a government. So that may also be related to this notion of people working together in order to form more positive impressions of one another.
Okay, so we have a question from one of our postdocs, Lita Rosenzweig, who's asking, anecdotally, it seems like recently in the US, there's a different manifestation of affective polarization, like an increase in, party or candidate sort of markers and symbols around the 2020 election. So partisanship has almost become sports-like, showing your support for and who you're a fan of. So do any of the data that you collect speak to how affective polarization has changed over time in becoming more sort of team-like than anything about actual politics or policy?
Yeah, so I think we hear a lot that I think there's something also very useful in thinking about this affective polarization or partisan resentment in terms of sports teams. I should say that I'm not following any sports, so I'm not the right person to talk to this issue. But I would say that there may be something slightly misleading in this metaphor, because I think it implied that I'm rooting for my team, so I really hate the other team, right? I care a lot about my own team, so I want to make sure that we are distracting the other team, as if there's some kind of a zero-sum game when it comes to affective polarization. And actually, that's not the case. And I think that's really, that's really intriguing. That perhaps in contrast to what this sports metaphor implies, in fact, where people have warmer feelings toward their own party, that's what we find in the comparative analysis, they also have warmer feelings toward the other party or other parties in a multi-party system. And it's a relationship, this positive sum relationship. It holds between countries, within countries over time, between individuals, within individuals over time. So that's why I'm cautious about this metaphor of sports team.
Okay, so another question from another postdoc, Nate Grubman, is saying that he has, on the thermometer score in particular, do you think of affective polarization as potentially a residual, non-policy based polarization, or do you think that it encompasses that? Because the thermometer score could include both affective polarization and ideological polarization. So are there measures that you would include in surveys that might better distinguish a purely affective score from an ideological assessment?
So that's a great question. And it's also one that is really hard to explore in the comparative context, simply because we don't have any data that goes beyond this feeling thermometer. I think ideally what we would do, and this is what has been done in the American context, is to collect different measures of affective polarization. None of them would be perfect, but we could still see whether they all move together in the same direction, whether they shift in tandem, if they are closely correlated, etc. When we work with cross-national data, we only have the feeling thermometer going back to the 90s. So I definitely agree that it captures also a lot of noise. I'm not sure that it only captures policy preferences, and in other analysis, we do account also for policy preferences, and we do find that there's this residual emotional or affective component, but it's just hard to say without collecting more data. Actually, together with my two colleagues, Jim Adams and Will Horn, we are now actually fielding a survey in 10 European countries where we'll also collect data, not just about the feeling thermometer questions, but also maybe these more intuitive social distance questions, like would you be willing to have someone from the other party as a family relative, a neighbor, a co-worker, etc. And also we will ask some open-ended questions in order to generate stereotypes of different partisan supporters. And hopefully that would allow us to more directly compare measures of affective polarization also in a comparative context and not just in the US, as has been done before.
Okay. So there's a question here about the Trump effect on polarization in the United States. And wondering, first of all, if your data can capture, leadership changes potentially. And there's been a noted rise in illiberalism around the world at the hands of specific leaders, right? It's not a general illiberalism. It's that you have a leader who is elected, who then changes and manipulates rules to stay in power or uses incredibly polarizing rhetoric. Do you have a way to capture that? Do you find that affective polarization increased under Donald Trump or under other leaders in other countries who are also considered similarly polarizing?
Yeah, so our data the last data point we have is 2016. So we cannot really compare what happened between 2016 and 2020, although I believe that actually affective polarization increased since then, based on what I've seen by other scholars. We don't have any reason to think based on our analysis that affective polarization increased more sharply simply because of Trump. Because we do find that affective polarization increased more sharply in the US compared to other countries, but that trend has its origins already in the mid-2000s. So we don't have a reason to think that it's simply Trump that has pushed affective polarization in the US to higher levels. Yeah, so actually our analysis would suggest that there are these longer trends also in terms of the growing salience of cultural issues in American politics, not something that started with Trump, but has its origins in the early 2000s or late 90s. And I think that our analysis suggests that there are these longer trends working here rather than simply a complete change in 2016.
Okay. So you already said that you would be willing to talk more about the far right. So now I'm going to ask you too. You have done plenty of other work on the relationship of the far right and the center right in advanced democracies. There has been a trend in your time period of far right parties emerging in multi-party systems, or factions of the far right becoming more prominent in two-party systems. Yeah. So do you think affective polarization potentially is a measure of how the electorate perceives party systems becoming more fragmented or more sort of tolerant of extremism? And how have various parties of the center accommodated parties of the far right?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting issue to think about. I think that most people would imagine that supporters of the radical right simply hate everyone else, right? They must hate all of these like mainstream parties, because we know that supporters of the radical right are attracted to this type of populist discourse that blames the elite for betraying the people. And we also have evidence from works in social psychology showing that populist radical right discourse generates negative emotion in people. So I think my intuition, at least, was that radical right voters really hate everyone else. But when we examine this issue empirically, what we found is the opposite. Mainstream partisans hate the radical right more than the other way around. So even after we account for radical right's positions on issues such as immigration, the issues that define them, we still find that people really dislike radical right parties. And interestingly, radical right partisans do not reciprocate. with the same intensity of dislike toward mainstream parties. So there's something of an affective radical right exceptionalism that people really dislike the radical right more than we would guess or more than we would predict just based on ideological positions. And I think it's an interesting question about what it tells us about the social cleavages, political tensions in modern Western societies. Because on the one hand, we know, I've done some work on this with Peter Hall, we know that radical right voters feel undervalued, unrecognized, misrecognized by mainstream society, and they are not wrong. People hate them. That being said, it may actually be a sign of a healthy democracy when people express very negative feelings toward parties that target marginalized groups, that in some cases adopt violence as a political measure. So it actually may be a sign of a healthy society that people have very negative feelings toward the radical right. And by the way, did you mention that these parties are increasingly incorporated into governments across Western Europe or have been normalized, which is indeed the case, but we haven't seen a decline in how much people dislike these parties in many countries. So there's still this affective radical right exceptionalism, which I think is really interesting.
Okay, interesting. So this question at the end about the relationship between electoral systems and the kinds of democratic politics you get, ever since 2020 and before that, there have been a lot of discussions about how to reform American institutions. In particular, their electoral institutions, because there are so few majoritarian countries that are like ours. So for the audience, that means, most other countries in his sample are multi-party proportional systems.
Yes.
But what do you, now voting rights and rules themselves are on the table at the state level in the United States. So do you think that electoral rules to become more proportional would have an effect on, the party system or polarization in the United States?
Yeah, so simply based on our analysis, we cannot develop a causal estimate saying if the US shifts toward a proportional system, this is the exact decline in affective polarization that we are likely to see. We simply cannot, put a number on it. But all the analysis that we've done, and of course we are inspired here by the work of other scholars such as Lee Drutman, all of the comparative analysis that we have done show that in multi-party systems, people have both more positive feelings toward their own party and more positive feelings toward the other parties. And it's just not clear to me why that shouldn't be the case also in the US in case it adopts a more proportional system. And as I also mentioned toward the end of my talk, based on the Israeli example, but we've also seen this cross-nationally, coalition governments are a major tool of diffusing affective polarization because after elections, after the harsh campaigns, parties have to work together. And then the supporters adopt more positive feelings toward one another. So that's a mechanism of cooperation that you simply do not have in the American type of the two-party system.
Okay. So for our final question, I'd like to ask you about directions for future research. It's interesting that we do have this assumption in a lot of the literature that polarization is bad for democracy. And there's a lot of empirical evidence that that's the case as well, like in How Democracies Die, which you cited at the top of your talk. But you're also indicating that affective polarization can be a sign of some kind of progress in society, that on cultural issues, these divisions are salient because they matter for democracy, about who gets to be included, who gets to have a voice. And ultimately, if you're affectively polarized in the context of the rise of an illiberal or undemocratic party, that is probably a good thing. So what do you think we should do as scholars to better understand the relationship of polarization and democracy? Like, when is it bad for democracy, and when might it actually be, sort of an indicator of progress?
Yeah, well, that's a tough question. I wish I could hear your answer to that, but maybe we can talk about it. Maybe we can talk about it later on. Well, I think that the first step toward a more comparative understanding of this topic is simply collecting data and doing some descriptive work. We usually prioritize causal inference research, and we want to measure the effects of specific changes on specific outcomes. But here we are talking on a very big phenomenon, political polarization, and we simply don't know much about how it looks like in most other countries other than the US. So I talked about affective polarization, and there was this great question, how can you measure it based on just one survey item? And I completely agree that we should just collect more comparative data about affective polarization, including social distance. We have a lot of arguments about the sorting that took place in the US, right? Liberals becoming Democrats and conservatives becoming Republicans. Is the US more ideologically sorted than France, the UK, Canada? I don't think anyone actually has an answer for that. And that's relevant for how we think about the implications of sorting for the American system. So I think that there's just a lot of interesting descriptive work that should be done here, some of it based on existing data, some would require collecting novel data, either survey or experimental. And I think that would really help us situate the US within a much broader context. And that should be at least one first step toward thinking about this issue from a broader perspective.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Noam, for this wonderful talk. Thank you to our audience. There are many of you I just don't know, honestly, in this era of Zoom, but I appreciate your joining us. And to the members of the CDDRL community, I look forward to seeing you in person one day, but please join us next week when we have our students presenting. And thank you, Noam, so much for giving this talk today.
Thank you, Didi.
Work. Bye.
Bye-bye.